Good morning, everyone. I'm Anne Marie Slaughter, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you. I can't see you, but I know you are, and we're particularly excited to have you join us for our first morning dialogue of 2021 on combating the infodemic in a digital world. This is a hugely topical subject, the subject of both misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation, obviously simply mistaken or wrong information. Disinformation, where it's deliberately wrong and aimed at a particular target. We are in the week of the anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic. I heard the head of the WHO, there was a clip from a year ago where he said, we don't use pandemic lightly, but we are in a pandemic. And over the summer and over the last months, we've also talked about essentially a pandemic of systemic racism, something big and structural and deep. We don't use infodemic lightly either, but the range of disinformation and misinformation and the range of consequences for our democracy, for our public health. Just right now, you're seeing mis and disinformation on vaccines, which could have a big impact on how many people get vaccinated. And after January 6th, on our national security. So we think it's justified to call it an infodemic and to tackle it the way we would a pandemic, a truly national and global threat. So I've got a fabulous panel to discuss these questions this morning, and then we'll be calling on all of you as well. Our panelists, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I will just tell you who they are. Meredith Berger, Jessica Deer, Peter Singer, Lisa Guernsey, and Spandy Singh. So with that, let me start. Meredith, I'll ask you to introduce yourself first.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anne-Marie, and great to be here. Hello, everybody. My name is Meredith Berger, and I am on the digital diplomacy team at Microsoft, where I specifically work on the Defending Democracy program. There we talk about election integrity, campaign security, and what's most important for the conversation today, disinformation defense. So look forward to speaking with everybody.
Great. Peter.
I'm Peter Singer. I work on technology and national security issues on topics that range from AI to the weaponization of information. And with my colleague, Lisa Guernsey, I've started a new project looking at digital literacy and cyber citizenship.
Which you will hear quite a bit about. So Lisa, let me go to you.
Yes, hi, welcome everyone, and thank you. I'm Lisa Guernsey. I direct the Teaching, Learning, and Tech program at New America. It's part of our education policy program, and I'm also senior advisor on early and elementary policy. And I'm excited to be talking about this new initiative that brings national security and education together.
Terrific. Spandy.
Hi, I'm Spandy Singh. I work at New America's Open Technology Institute on issues of content moderation and algorithmic accountability. And my work on disinformation has thus far focused on COVID-19, US election, and voter suppression disinformation.
You can just see from the range of programs represented that the many different angles that we have to approach this subject from. So Jessica. You're on mute.
Hi, sorry about that. Hi, I'm Jessica Deer. I'm the director of the Ranking Digital Rights program. We're a public interest research program based here at New America that looks at the world's most powerful digital platforms and telecommunications companies and evaluates them according to their disclosed commitments to protect and respect human rights, particularly freedom of expression and privacy, because of their importance for our information ecosystem.
Great. And Jessica, we're going to start with you exactly on that question of the responsibility of companies. Over the course of the hour, we'll talk about government responsibility, the teachers' responsibility from the states, from the federal level, as well as all of our responsibility. But let's start with the companies, because we're very aware of the power that tech companies have to shape the online environment. And of course, we've seen Twitter essentially remove former President Trump's principal platform. So it's important for us to understand how companies are doing what they're doing and how much they disclose. And Jessica, I want to ask you then to describe what the Corporate Accountability Index is and some of the top level findings from this year's index, which has just been released.
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. The Corporate Accountability Index reached its 5th edition this year. We started publishing in 2015. And in the index, we evaluate what we call the world's most powerful digital platforms and telecommunications companies on their disclosed commitments to protect and respect human rights. We've developed a pretty robust methodology that is based in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And we take we ask about 58 sort of broad questions about how companies look at their governance and what policies they disclose around their governance of human rights, and also how do they operationalize those policies to protect freedom of expression and privacy in particular. We just released the index a couple of weeks ago now, and sort of some of the key sort of findings and takeaways. Twitter took the top spot this year, which was new, and it did so because it has begun to disclose more about its content moderation processes and how it enforces its rules than it has done in the past, and more than its peers do. And I think of particular note is that Amazon came in dead last. We ranked Amazon this year for the first time, and its governance was severely lacking, as well as its implications for freedom of expression and privacy. And considering that this platform collects so much user data, it's quite worrying. I think another sort of big takeaway is that the US platforms that we rank, which include Facebook, Google, Apple, Verizon Media, didn't move the needle that much, in part because we debuted a new set of indicators this year that are specifically looking at what do companies disclose around algorithmic systems and targeted advertising. And these systems are so essential to this conversation around misinformation and disinformation because they're used to drive engagement and profits, and actually have a very strong role to play in the amplification of a lot of the mis and disinformation we see. Other sort of findings, it's not all terrible news. We do see companies making improvements in their commitments to human rights and disclosures around due diligence, especially when it's related to government demands. We're seeing some better transparency reporting on content moderation, but overall, and some improvements on disclosures around data breaches and what the protocols are for happening in the event of those of data breaches. But overall, we're really struck by how little companies across the board are willing to publicly disclose about how they shape and moderate digital content, how they enforce their own rules, how they collect and use our data, particularly in these with these algorithms as training data and in the targeted advertising ecosystem, and how are they building and deploying those algorithms that are shaping our information realities. And we focus on transparency, and this lack of transparency is really making it hard for all of us working to develop and promote effective policy solutions to ensure that they're fit for purpose and they don't end up causing human rights harms themselves. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So first of all, I just want to ask for transparency to the audience. We do not rank Microsoft, is that correct?
Oh, we do rank Microsoft.
Okay,
yes.
all right. So I wanted to make, so I actually wanted to ask you, and Meredith, you're going to get a chance to say anything you'd like in response. But what is the criteria by which you choose the companies? Because I know they're telecommunications companies as well as the big social media companies, and I know it's global. It's not just U.S.
It is global. We ranked 26 companies this year, 14 digital platforms, and 12 telecommunications companies. The digital platforms include Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, as I said earlier, and we added Amazon and Alibaba this year. And the criteria. So these companies, all 26 of these companies, reach the 4.6 billion internet users around the world. So one of the criteria is the reach of these companies, either globally or within their region. Another criteria is that these companies are publicly listed on stock exchanges, because that really helps with the disclosures that they release. So there are certain requirements that they have to release, and that gives us a good sort of barometer for how transparent that they will be.
So I'm going to turn to Spandy in a minute to talk more about the algorithms, but Meredith, if you want to jump in here, you're welcome to.
Sure, I'll just make a couple of quick comments. And one of the features of the report, which was the algorithmic transparency measures, which is increasing around the world. So it's very timely to be thinking about that and looking at that. And so as we see European laws like the Platform to Business Law or the Digital Services Act expanding, this is certainly a consideration that's important. And I'll offer, in terms of transparency, one careful guide that I think that we as an ecosystem need to think about is making sure that we are transparent in a way that helps policy and not so transparent that we give way too much, so those who are trying to work against good ideas and good policy can actually try and game the system or otherwise be more harmful in the environment. So I think that's a line that we need to continue to think about, but it's an important thing that we think about as a group, as an ecosystem.
Great. So Spandy, you've done a lot of work on algorithms and how they shape what we see and really what we interact with online. So talk about how their AI tools, right, these algorithms, how do they contribute to the infodemic, and what can platforms, the companies themselves, and policymakers do to fight the infodemic by regulating or otherwise engaging with algorithms?
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So like you mentioned, platforms deploy a range of algorithmic tools to curate the content we see online, and this can be through content moderation tools, as well as through tools that amplify the content we see using ranking, recommendation systems, and targeted ads. And just to go a little bit deeper into some of the points that Jessica was mentioning, each platform designs these algorithmic tools to prioritize a different set of metrics, but generally most of them are designed to emphasize engagement in some way. And the logic of this is that engaging content will help retain user attention, which means that a platform has more opportunities to target a user with ads and generate more revenue. But engaging content, as we know, is not always good. It can be sensational, it can be misleading. And so in this way, the fundamental business model of these companies can really contribute to the rapid spread of misinformation and disinformation. In terms of potential solutions, OTI has been pushing platforms, especially over the past year, to alter their algorithmic tools to reduce the spread of misleading content. And we've seen that in the last year, platforms have implemented some changes in this vein, especially when it comes to tackling COVID-19 and election-related misinformation and disinformation. And these changes have primarily focused on introducing friction into the information flow by, for example, asking a user to read a post before they share it, or telling them that, this post was forwarded multiple times. Are you sure you want to share it? And I think these kinds of checks and balances against this algorithmically curated online information flow are really important to stemming the spread of the infodemic. In terms of policymaker action, in the United States, the First Amendment limits the extent to which the US government can direct companies to moderate or curate content. But I think an area where policymakers can help enact change is by passing rules that would require platforms to be more transparent around how they design and implement these interventions. Because just going back to what Jessica said, without this kind of information, we don't know what works. And to sort of close it out, with additional support, OTI would continue to lean into this work and develop and refine further policy recommendations to address the harms caused by the infodemic and the ad-driven business models that undergird internet platforms. We see OTI's work as a clear complement to the work from other New America programs participating in today's conversation, and we're really excited to develop deeper partnerships that maximize each program's strengths and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm reminded as you're talking that Tim Wu, who was a former New America Fellow and actually coined the term net neutrality when he was a New America Fellow as a book, and he's just been appointed to a White House position advising on antitrust. But his second book was called The Attention Merchants. And that's exactly what you're describing, right? People are buying attention. The underlying business model, as you said, is to keep people engaged so that they will see the ads. And we've a lot of places, including us, have done work on the fundamental problem of the business model. But you can see even so Jessica's talking about ranking digital rights, which is like a consumer reports for the big tech and platform companies. That's a way of civic engagement. We can also have government directly regulating, although constrained by the First Amendment and other laws. So those are two different strategies, but as you say, quite complementary. Meredith, let me come to you to talk about yet another strategy, because you're working in the Defending Democracy program with a set of partners to combat misinformation. So you've got here's something coming from the companies and working with partners globally. So why don't you tell us about that?
Certainly. And when it comes to democracy, you see technology used as a great accelerator and also as a base for a lot of the threats that we see impacting democracy, especially as we've been sharply reminded lately. And so when we think about this issue, and especially when it comes to information, misinformation, disinformation, there is a spectrum of problems and a spectrum of solutions. And so no one entity, individual, anyone is going to be able to solve it alone. And so that's why we partner. And so we think about different initiatives, whether it is technology to help to combat mis and disinformation. Microsoft, as a technology company, has a tremendous basis upon which to explore and work on these things. News literacy, which I know is an important issue for this group. We also explore opportunities for norms in the ecosystem to start to talk about what it means to behave appropriately on this topic. It is certainly amorphous, asymmetric, but the Paris call for security and trust is one place where we are a co-champion, especially looking at election interference, working with the Alliance for Securing Democracies as part of the German Marshall Fund and the Government of Canada to look at it from a multi-stakeholder, multilateral approach so that we can start to think about how to work on it collectively.
So that when you say the Paris call, you're talking about the Paris Peace Forum?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. Principle number 3 is on countering election interference.
So we're going to turn shortly to how we approach the infodemic from a very different perspective, from digital literacy and civil and cyber citizenship. But Jessica, just one last question. You've done a lot of work. The Open Technology Institute and Ranking Digital Rights have both done work, but on this issue of the business model. What can we do? I mean, it is this underlying structural incentive to create these algorithms that do engage, and then of course that intersects with human psychology, which is the more extreme, the more intense. And many of us have gone down internet rabbit holes. The younger you are, I talk to my sons, and they'll spend a lot of time hopping from one thing to another, very quickly getting to much more extreme positions. Not my sons per se, but people. So just talk for a minute about what can we do to shape, combat, affect the business model.
Well, I would say that each time that people are going down those rabbit holes, whatever they are, data is being collected about them. And not only is that data being collected about them, that data is being used to create new inferred data about them, to make predictions about their interests, their behaviors, and to sort of filter them into different categories that are sort of ripe for targeting with advertisements. That's the whole business model. And some of these categories that people get filtered into without their knowledge and without their ability to sort of dictate or to tell the companies, we don't want you to collect that information or make these assumptions about us, can be categories that are protected or proxies for protected categories or political leanings, and things that we should be able to keep private if we want to, and things that may or may not be true. So what's interesting about this is that the best way to mitigate these harms isn't to try to define what is speech or free speech in our environment, but the best way to mitigate the harms is to protect people's privacy and to protect their data. So one of the things that we can do that I think would be a fundamental game changer is to develop or to pass sort of rights respecting user-centered privacy or data protection legislation.
Wait a minute, say that one more time. Rights respecting.
Yes, rights respecting data protection and privacy legislation in the United States.
Data,
Yeah, and we say this and give a lot of other recommendations in reports that we produced last year that we call it's the business model reports. And there are also some other things that can be done in terms of mandating more transparency around ads, sort of mandating some human rights due diligence before companies debut products. I think point out there's a new report from MIT Tech Review today about how Facebook got addicted to spreading misinformation. And in it, one of the things is that they say they created some of the first algorithms for targeting users, then diffused those algorithms. Now the mandate is to make them less harmful. We need to reverse that process. There's also some rules that the SEC can do. Shareholders are starting to get involved, and we produce an investor update that sort of interprets our results for investors. And shareholders, because of the dual class share system at the SEC, sometimes don't have enough power to actually have their voices heard at the board level. So there are several things that we can do from a policy perspective. I think, to encapsulate all of it is we need to focus on the business model and the systems that are underlying what we're seeing in terms of mis and disinformation, and not try to redefine speech based on what the effects are.
terrific. And I'll just say that I, as an international lawyer, as a foreign policy person, I think it's very important that the Ranking Digital Rights Index, but more broadly, this work be connected to international human rights standards. With the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1949 and all the work that was done in international law and indeed in foreign policy. Jimmy Carter first introduced human rights focused in US foreign policy, you don't want to lose that now that we are moving to the digital world. You want to build on it and adapt those rights to digital content and digital spaces. All right, so Peter and Lisa, we're gonna now look at how we fight the infodemic from the point of view of educating citizens. And I'll say again, last summer, my 24-year-old son, who should be pretty savvy about these things, came in and said, "Mom, have you seen this Biden video?" And it was Biden saying something really terrible. And I looked at him and said, "That can't be real. I mean, just what are you talking about?" And I was stunned that his reflexive reaction was not, "This is a fake." So that's a very educated person and a young person, and we know that often it's over 55-year-olds who are most susceptible in places like Facebook. So what are we going to do from the point of view of educating the citizenry? And Peter, I'll start with you, and then come to Lisa.
Sure, thank you. It's interesting, sort of recollecting earlier today, I was at an event, or virtually at an event, that was hosted by a group called WantComs that was looking at how the industry of think tanks, so going to Jessica's term, about business model, how our broader industry, not just New America, but how overall, how it's handled this problem set of mis and disinformation. And one of the findings of this conversation was that the vast majority of the work and the debate has been on altering what you might think of either the software code or the legal code side. So the software code is that discussion around how do the companies alter, for example, their content moderation, their algorithms, et cetera. The legal code side is the discussion on everything from altering, breaking up the companies themselves to new regulations, you name it. And yet, what is notable is that when we look at the recommendations of what we ought to do, there's a third space. And there's colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment actually brought together 85 different reports from 51 different organizations, not just New America, so 50 other ones. And they found that when you did this landscape view, the most frequently recommended action item was the point that you had, Anne-Marie, was to bolster our education on how to use the internet more effectively. And just as you said, it's not your age. It's not your traditional education level. There's rather a set of skills of how you engage with online information that basically can act as almost relevant to discussion, kind of an inoculator. They give you a resistance to mis and disinformation. And it's called in different frames digital literacy or cyber citizenship. And what's important about these skill sets is that they inoculate against almost any kind of mis or disinformation, whether it is Russian political or it's coronavirus, whatever. If you have these skills, it allows you to better navigate. It also still respects your First Amendment rights. It's also inherently nonpartisan, you name it. There's a problem though. First off, of the roughly 139,000 schools in America, many of them don't teach this kind of skill set. Of the ones that teach it, they're not well funded. The tools that are out there are not gathered into one place. They're not well evaluated. And so teachers are in many cases literally reduced to Googling to try and find the best tools to teach their students with. And so what we, Lisa and myself, starting last year, built a program called the Cyber Citizenship Project, which is basically a broader agenda of action that's going after this. It's doing everything from coalition building. We've brought together people with national security, tech policy, education backgrounds, groups that range from namely the National Association of Media Literacy Educators to members of the US military, you name it, all coming together around this. We're conducting research. And then the final most exciting things is the partnership we have with the Florida State Education System, where we're building an actual portal that's going to bring together these tools into one place for K through 12 teachers in Florida to be able to find the digital literacy tools that are matched to their needs. So a fourth grade teacher will be able to go into it and find, exactly what works for fourth graders, which is very different than a 12th grade teacher. So that's what we're doing right now. Lisa can speak to, what we want to do next. It's a great story, but it's also, kind of interesting, or maybe to put it bluntly, disappointing that we're only doing that in Florida.
So Lisa, as I turned to you, I was listening to Peter, and I'm looking at and thinking, which of these squares or which of these people is not like the other? Because in the sense that so often we discuss these issues from the point of tech policy and national security. That's very standard. So we can talk about cybersecurity. We can talk about thinking about tech regulation. You come out of early learning and education. You created New America's early and elementary education program, and then moved on to learn technology and learning. Just talk to us about both what you're doing with this project on cyber citizenship, but also what this looks like from your point of view, because you really do come at it from a very different set of perspectives.
Yeah, thank you, Anne-Marie, and Peter as well, for kind of serving up what we're working on. I mean, because of our work on basically the developing mind, what we have come to understand is that we need to make sure that part of our response to mis and disinformation is recognizing that individual human beings, students at whatever age, but certainly adults as well, have a tool to work against disinformation, and that is their own brain and the mindsets they have and their habits of mind and their approaches to information. And what we've also learned in education is that learning these new things doesn't just happen. You need teachers and mentors. You need digital instructional materials, all kinds, but certainly in this case, you need really high quality digital instructional materials, and you need the platforms for that learning to happen, for people to share what they're experiencing, talk about their news environment, talk about their media environment, to ask each other questions about, wait, is that meme that came across my phone? Like, what do you think? Did somebody doctor that photo or not? Or even to have built the habits of mind to ask that question in the first place. So what Peter's describing is our kind of first step towards exploring this, which is we've seen that there are a lot of responses across the education system to this now, but they're happening in lots of different places and they're kind of spotty and they're disconnected. So we have researchers who have made huge strides in better understanding how to kind of teach the critical thinking that we need for this. It's not just about old-fashioned critical thinking and not just about like old-fashioned fact checking, but it's really about understanding your information ecosystem. We have teachers that are building new tools. We have game designers that are building really cool games. And we want to put all of those in a searchable database and portal so that your educator of whatever age group it is can easily find what they need, can embed it in their already existing lesson plans, or can shift a bit of their curriculum to much more kind of comprehensively attack this problem. And so we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that needs to happen across the education system. It certainly isn't just Florida where this can happen. We're excited that Cyber Florida and the universities across Florida really want to work on this issue and will be the model for how to build this out. What we'll be building is something that'll be available to educators in any state and honestly in any country. And we think that there's ways to align it across different states for different purposes, to build it out for different types of skills. And yeah, we're excited for what the possibilities lay ahead.
That's great. I know some of our friends from Deloitte are listening, and I was just on a panel that Deloitte put on rebuilding trust. And one of the panelists was Camille Francois, who is at Graphica and also the Harvard Berkman Klein Center. And her proposition is that everyone should be taught to make deep fakes. That really, if you knew how to make them and understood how easy it was, you would be much more skeptical. As one would hope that given the way kids and grown-ups doctor their Instagram images, they should understand that they're not looking at anything real. But this question of, what works best, as we do with all kinds of education, needs a lot of experimentation and a lot of engagement. So.
And if I could just connect it to what both Jessica and Spandy and Meredith have mentioned as well, what we're finding is that, I mean, this is not, of course, at all a knock on teachers. They have a lot to do. A lot's been going on this year as well. But there's no way that they can possibly understand how much the algorithmic bias that's baked in now into our social media systems is affecting the way their students are seeing information, right? They need some tools. They need some training to help bring those ideas and those concepts to light so that our students can start to actually ask themselves questions like, oh, why was I served up that information? Why is YouTube recommending that I see this next video? And so we need the tool sets for our teachers so that they can then understand these concepts and bring that to our students.
Fascinating. So Meredith, let me come back to you. We've been talking about Microsoft's work on cybersecurity, on defending democracy. I'm actually on the board of the Cyber Peace Institute, which Brad Smith and Larry Kramer of the Hewlett Foundation created. But I know you're also thinking about digital literacy. So maybe you could talk to us about that.
Absolutely. And before entirely going away from cybersecurity, just want to add into the conversation that so often these mis and disinformation threats echo, follow, precede a lot of cybersecurity actions that we see in the ecosystem. And so it's important, I think, for thinking about how to combat it, that we do think about the relationship among these types of threats that we see. But I love talking about this topic. I think it's such an important thing to create resilience in the ecosystem. And back to what you had asked earlier, it is about partnerships and working together and collaboration and finding opportunities to be able to do that. So as Peter and Lisa are talking about getting to younger members of society, but also reaching out to those who may not be digital natives who need kind of that extra piece of education, we're thinking about both sides of the spectrum here, because it is the whole that creates that resilience in society. So at the further end of the spectrum, we've partnered with the Radio, Television, Digital News Association for a series of public service announcements designed to cause people to stop, think, reflect, much like many of the other panelists were saying. How can we be able to make sure to create that habit of going in and pausing and reflecting? Similarly, I mentioned earlier, and we've touched a little bit on the concept of maliciously manipulated media. And so we think about that, and we partnered with Reality Defender 2020, and we're able to put out a deep fake detector tool, which is not a silver bullet. That's very important to say. But not only does it start to educate people, especially those who are in the practices where they're most impacted by this harm, so journalists, political actors, others who are having an opportunity to test that right now. But it also creates that habit, that practice of saying, wait, let me check first, let me think first. And so not only is it a technological solution that helps to further the progress in the ecosystem, but also it creates that literacy, that resilience that causes people to stop, pause, and think. And then I'll just make one more comment that every conversation is the opportunity to be making people more literate, more resilient. And I loved, Emery, how you at the beginning of your remarks defined what is misinformation, what is disinformation, what are we talking about? Because the less people know how to use the basic language of the harm, the more harmful it is to them. And so that's another thing that I think from all angles, we have the opportunity to inject those pieces of education, and we should continue to do so as we work across this problem.
No, so thank you for that. And again, calling this an infodemic is important because it helps people see the scale of what we're facing, that it affects everything from vaccines to elections to cyber attacks in terms of national and international security. So it's important to name it and then to understand how all these different parts are linked. And one way to think about it, for at least the way I think about it often, is what would a healthy public square look like? Right? It'll never be a perfectly healthy public square. In physical public squares, you have somebody on top of a soapbox ranting about something that may or may not be in touch with reality. But overall, we know what healthy public debate looks like. We know what healthy interactions look like. So you imagine what that would be, and then you see how far we are from that because of this infodemic. And I'll just say also the learning. When I was first on Twitter, I would retweet things. I would read them, but I quickly learned, particularly in sensitive areas, like if you were tweeting on Syria or tweeting on Egypt or the Arab Spring, to go to a couple very trusted sources and retweet them, because very quickly I realized I'm being manipulated. Somebody knows I'm tweeting, and somebody's sending me pictures, and they were often fakes. So it is something we can learn like everything else. So Jessica, I'm going to come to you. And I want us to turn to the equity concerns, because all of these issues have profound equity implications in terms of who is targeted and who is most affected. But so I'm gonna come to you and ask you if you want to say anything more about the digital literacy issue, but then if you could turn us to equity, and then we'll go back to Spandy, who's done a tremendous amount of work on racism in algorithms.
Sure. Just quickly on the digital literacy, I think as a media studies person, as a former journalist, I'm all for digital literacy. It's, I think, one of the harder topics because it has such a long-term time horizon, and so getting support for it can be quite difficult, getting it integrated into curricula. And I would just also underscore that I think a digital literacy isn't simply about learning tools and how to make different types of media, but is also about understanding sort of how the media's role in society, historically, what are network effects, and how, why are network effects so important in the digital age, and frankly, how social movements work, because they are so dependent on being able to get your message out, tailor your message to different groups. And also just, since you brought up the Arab Spring, I worked in the Middle East for more than a decade. And I think one of the misconceptions that I see sometimes about digital literacy is that people, a lot of the people that tend to hold more conspiratorial views or what we might think of as media illiterate views are actually quite literate in media, but they've lost trust in the media. And so I think it's as much as I support digital literacy, it can't only be the individual's responsibility to filter through all of this. And so it's really sort of an environment that's broken down where there's a distrust in the media or a distrust in the government, and that creates a void through which sort of not good actors can exacerbate that. And it's very related to issues of equity. Because people who have less access, less ability to sort of interpret, less time to filter, are often the people who are sort of more vulnerable and strapped because of work obligations and other sorts of things, have less choices in terms of where they're getting their media, less time to process that. The way the Ranking Digital Rights and the index sort of incorporates equity is sort of, we are fundamentally using a rights-based framework, and sort of the bottom line that for us is that policy transparency helps people. It's not always a direct route because we need to help the researchers, the advocates, the investors sort of translate the data that we have for their own campaigns, which is really the role that we want to play going forward, is to continue to produce the research and then package that research for the different stakeholder groups who are best positioned to use it in their own work. And one of the things that in our sort of grounding of our methodology in human rights, RDR produces human rights risk scenarios, many of which are developed from documented experience, lived experiences of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, both here in the United States and also globally. And so we really strongly believe that by adhering to universal rights standards as a baseline, if companies will address them, then the inequities will be reduced. And we see that really clearly in the companion essay that we wrote this year for the index. We wrote 3 companion essays to try and interpret our results through different lenses. One of them, called Context for Code, Before Code, really looks at the pandemic and how companies' unpreparedness to respond to the pandemic has actually disproportionately affected the already most vulnerable and marginalized from an information perspective. We see this daily in headlines as in the US as people of color have had less access to care, to vaccines, and are more victimized by mis and disinformation in the pandemic. And we really submit that if companies were adhering to the standards that we've laid out very clearly in our methodology, that they would be prepared for crises, pandemics, disasters, and social justice types of crises that we saw with the police murder of George Floyd, and that they would also be more resilient in the face of these. So that's one of the ways that we look at it. That's sort of broadly speaking.
You make the point. You make the point that you made at the outset there too. I mean, the worries about the vaccine, say in the African American community, part of that's misinformation. Part of that is against the backdrop of the Tuskegee experiment, and obviously there is mistrust and justified mistrust, so the two interact. So to the audience, you should start putting your questions into the Q&A or to the chat, because I'm going to be turning to you soon. But Spandy, let me come back to you on targeted advertising and content moderation, and the ways that both of those often lead to inequities and what we can do about that.
Sure. So OTI has done pretty extensive research on how algorithmic ad systems can deliver ads on housing, employment, and other issues in a discriminatory manner. So, for example, if an employment ad is deployed by an algorithm that's been trained on data that reflects historical patterns of discrimination. So, for example, the fact that at one point doctors used to be mostly white and male, then the algorithm may predict that only these kinds of users will find an ad for medical school or a job at a hospital relevant. And this kind of discriminatory outcome has raised a number of concerns around civil rights and racial justice in the United States. Similarly, in content moderation, we've seen that platforms are increasingly relying on automated tools for detection and removal. And these tools are unable to adequately assess context and nuance, especially across different communities, cultures, and languages. The way that one word is used in the United States may be completely different in another country. And that can, and these variations often harm marginalized communities the most. We've also seen that platforms are demonstrating vast inconsistencies in how they enforce their policies and how they offer access to remedy and redress, depending on the country and the community. So some of the solutions that we've been discussing in our recent work include pushing policymakers to clarify that offline anti-discrimination statutes do apply in the digital environment. So for example, if a platform delivers a housing ad in a discriminatory manner, they should be held accountable under the Fair Housing Act. Similarly, we've also been pressing platforms to provide adequate notice and appeals to users. As I mentioned, there are inconsistencies in terms of who has access to these remedies. And this really underscores the need for platforms to be engaging with a broader range of stakeholders when they develop and implement new policies so that they can identify and mitigate potential harms. And then lastly, and this is something that we've been working on at OTI more recently, as more research demonstrates that algorithmic systems can produce discriminatory outcomes, company algorithmic systems need to be subject to regular audits and impact assessments, which can identify these harms and help companies identify a roadmap for mitigating them. And this is a really key mechanism for promoting transparency and accountability. And I think it's an area that's very ripe for more research and more work.
Very helpful. It's really, again, as we move into the digital world, essentially the companies have to provide enough information to allow civil society and government to do its job. I mean, to hold them accountable. So Peter, I know you're working with the organizers of an initiative called Share the Mic in Cyber. So talk about that work and the equity implications there.
Sure. So it's a really interesting network that was founded by Camille Stewart to address the issues of where race crosses with the cybersecurity field. And it has a particular focus on elevating the voices of African Americans on these key issues. And it started with a Share the Mic event, which in effect paired 120 African Americans working in cybersecurity with allies. And basically the people ranged from CEOs and CISOs all the way down to people starting out in the field, think tank analysts, you name it. And this program went amazing, actually far beyond expectations. Reached some 1.5 million people on Twitter. And so after that test, it's followed up with another, and then there's an upcoming event actually on March 19th that's going to highlight Black women working in security and privacy, of course, to link up to Women's History Month. But from this, it led to all sorts of other spin-out programming. It's, for example, support for professional development of people working in the field, means for donors to sponsor certification and training for participating Black practitioners, connecting people into networks for board seats, startup support, you name it, a spin out DEF CON village. And so, a lot of cool, exciting things happening. And so the next step of it is that we're basically exploring, okay, how do you institutionalize it? How do you organize it? How do you do this for the long term and scale it out? And that's what we're trying to locate here at New America, and certainly happy to engage with anyone who wants to support it and help build out this program.
As always, it's the issues, the content, and the people. I mean, you have to do all three. So Lisa, you've also worked a lot on digital equity. And talk about how the sort of broader digital equity space intersects with the disinformation and misinformation issues.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's become very clear especially over the past year, is that we have to get a lot more sophisticated in what we understand about digital equity. So both other work that we've done in the education policy program and with OTI, and then this particular project with Peter around national security, have highlighted how much understanding how to use digital tools and kind of get a handle on our information environment is not just about being connected. It's not just about making sure everyone has internet access. It's also, digital equity also includes the teachers and mentors, and maybe it's librarians. Who's the trusted source in the orbit of particular people who are trying to kind of get a handle on all of this. And right now we're seeing that it's primarily white, more well-off, suburban school districts that don't have high numbers of children on free and reduced price lunch programs. Those are the ones that have access to those trusted mentors, and those troubleshooters, as people help them understand what media to look for, how to be more selective. And in other communities that were already under-resourced, there aren't as many opportunities for them to connect with those trusted mentors. So we need to be looking at that whole, the full ecosystem of where people are getting their information, but also who's helping them and who's connected to them, and how are their lives centered in the way information is presented, and what kind of voice do they have and ability to kind of connect their desires, as well as like the way that they're seeing the world into the conversation. And so it's obviously very multifaceted, but we are re-emphasizing as much as we can how much we need to make sure that there's a human-centered approach to the way we're thinking about the information environment, because that's kind of key to the equity issue.
Great. So I'm going to turn to the audience in 1 more minute. Please bring in your questions. I always have to say, Lisa, I love the concept of digital mentors. And I often think of the role that public libraries can play, which is an area you've also worked. And I just imagine public libraries with digital mentors for every age, right? If I think of my parents who, my mother has to go and pay for somebody to come and help her with very basic things. And you can imagine older people sort of going to the public library for a class, for younger people mentoring older people, as well as obviously people working with younger kids. But it's a great role that we need in society. So Meredith, talk to us about the way in which the Defending Democracy Project integrates equity issues.
Sure. And just listening to everybody speak, I realized that I forgot to mention something that would be useful in this conversation as we talk about libraries and educators and the various convening points where people can learn. And one of our partners is NewsGuard, which is an organization that helps to identify whether information that is accessed on the internet is credible content through a rating system. They use 9 journalistic criteria to give a news site a green, yellow, or red rating. And they are available throughout libraries, actually throughout the world, not just the United States. And so as we talk about a place for convening and a place where people can access good information, credible information, and start to create those habits, that was something that I wanted to highlight in the conversation today as a resource that's out there. And digital literacy can be fun too. We've actually created 2 quizzes, one on deepfakes and one on news consumption. I'll put the links in the chat. They're pretty challenging, so I invite everybody to give them a whirl and see how you do. And hopefully it's a good learning opportunity for you all as well. On your question of integrating equity, Anne-Marie, it's an important consideration for sure. And I'll note that in terms of how we think about how we combat these threats, it's important to think about the groups that are most targeted by mis and disinformation, and these are vulnerable groups. I think about colleagues, many who probably know some of these folks, like Nina Jankowicz, who has been very thoughtful on mis and disinformation around women journalists. We think about traditionally the synthetic media that's been manipulated is going to target Similarly, journalists, minority groups, and also take advantage of people who don't have access to credible information or the ability to discern. And so these people and these groups are being targeted. And so that's one consideration as we develop technology and solutions and think about who we are accessing through partnerships and educational opportunities. That is at the forefront of our minds. I'll also add that to make sure that you are being equitable, you have to put the consideration of equity and inclusiveness at the front end. And so Microsoft, especially as we think about how to develop technology and work in the AI sphere, we have a set of responsible AI principles that consider all of these different components. So as we build and apply technology, equity and inclusion is at the beginning, so that when it's applied, it's already a consideration.
That's great. So we have a question. We've only got 4 minutes, but we've got a question here that I'm going to direct to Spandy first. And Jessica, you may want to weigh in and others. Facebook's oversight board seems like an interesting model for platform accountability. So what are your thoughts? And should that or could that model be replicated to other platforms? So Spandy, let me start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think as we've been pushing platforms to give users access to more remedy and redress, the oversight board is an interesting model that is an alternative to the existing structures. In terms of whether the oversight board should be replicated, I think it's a little early to say. They've only started reviewing their first set of cases. And in order for this kind of a structure to really be worth it, it needs to be independent, it needs to be legitimate. We need to see commitment from Facebook in the long term that they're going to use the board its recommendations. Right now, the board is only set up so it can provide policy guidance, not binding recommendations and it can't review a substantial amount of Facebook's operations. It's only a limited set of cases in a year. So I think it's an interesting model, but it's definitely too early to determine whether, it's a model that should be replicated and whether it's a viable alternative for remedy and redress at a large scale and in the long term.
Great. So actually, Peter had a 2-finger. We have 3 minutes, so I'm going to get to everybody if you want to. But Peter, you're next, and then I'll go to Jessica. I think that was a 2-finger.
Yeah, I would just say very rapidly. It's an improvement to where they were previously, so it's a valuable addition. It's good that it's also made up of a diverse set of experts. However, the framing of it as oversight or board is a pretty massive overstatement. And too much of the media and discussion has fallen into that. It is still advisory, self-regulatory. It's basically not a board in terms of they have to follow, as Spandy put it, it's recommendations, and Facebook takes those and decides whether to act on or not. So it's a self-selected, self-regulatory advisory group that is much better than where they were before, but do not confuse this as oversight or board.
And I'll just jump in to say that OTI's policy director, Sharon Bradford Franklin, and we wrote a piece literally on that topic. Sharon used to serve on an oversight board. I'll drop the link in the chat.
Great. Jessica.
I'll just wrap the Facebook board conversation by saying in addition to the other criticisms that have been aired here, one of our big problems with it is that there's no fundamental human rights framework that underlies it. And I think this is also a challenge that we see with some responsible AI ethics programs is that they're not legally binding. They're not, they're not universally accepted or legally binding. And so we would have really liked to have seen more of a human rights commitment in the Facebook oversight board.
That is great. Well, we are at time, and it's been a rich conversation, really a wonderful way to kick off our morning dialogue series. So I hope you'll come back. We'll be doing these regularly on similarly broad topics where we can bring together multiple strands of work. And I want to thank all of our panelists. It was a really rich conversation. And wish you all, depending on where you are, a full great day or a great afternoon. So thanks, everybody.